But then from there, I remember when you left, I was like, what? And you went on to WB,
Yeah.
and you were like, yeah. It's almost like from talking to you, you were so excited. Like you were like, because I think it was because it was that transition into games, and WB was about games, movies, TV. It was
Yeah.
like everything, and
Yeah.
you were just like, oh. Like you were like you couldn't wait to like get it, like meld into everything you possibly could there, and like communicate and network and everything, and you were over the moon
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. That. Yeah.
That's pretty crazy. I
Well-
remember you gave me a tour of the lot. I
Yeah.
think one time when
Uh-huh.
you were like, "Yo, you got to come through and come check it out," and you were like, "That's where they shot that. That's where they shot that." You
Yeah.
already had everything memorized. Like,
Yeah. I mean, that was, the time at Warner Brothers was.
it was like rock star moments, man. Well, from me looking in at you,
Yeah.
it's like you got elevated because you could see the desire and passion in you exuding of like, it was like you like, I made it, I'm here. You were still new there, but that's how it came across.
Well, I mean, that was the case.
Yeah.
But the funny part was, it's like the WB games that you see now, like I was the first employee.
Wow.
I was employee number 1, right? Because the decision to get into games was born out of the strategic planning division inside of Warner Brothers, right? Because they had been in games, and they were the people who eventually decided that they should take all those ET cartridges and bury them, right? So that's Warner Brothers.
Yes.
And so they were like, should we get back into this? And so those ideas start in strategic planning at Warner Brothers. And so they had to find someone who knew games, right? Mm-hmm. So here I am, right?
Nice. Okay.
Like, and so in addition to that, like, having to work directly with the Wachowskis and do everything that is Matrix, which, was one of my favorite movies of all time. It was both intimidating and exciting at the same time, but I had to fight battles differently. Mm-hmm. And although the language that they speak in Hollywood is English, it is completely different from the English that you realize, right? And knowing how to speak Hollywood is something that I had to learn, because it was not what I was accustomed to. And so I had to ride that line, which was very interesting. And being in strategic planning, for example, everyone came to work in a suit and tie. Mm-hmm.
Your outfit, your attire did change. I remember you dressing up more and stuff like that.
And the funny
but you're
part,
in their element.
Well, yeah. So the funny part was, it's like, so I have to come to work. I have to wear this, these suits and these ties and all this other kinds of stuff. And I remember this, like, the first day I went to go see the Wachowskis, and then I came in there with a suit and tie, and they're like, and it was sort of like this. It was crazy because I'm sitting here reading like the Matrix sequels, right? And when I'm sitting here reading the Matrix sequels, there's their table was a big circuit board, right? Mm-hmm. And then they had this huge camera was pointing at me, right, like right down at me, and I had these scripts in front of me, and every page had my name on it. It was the first time I ever seen a like one of these top secret scripts with my name on it, and a camera pointed at me, right? And I'm like, and it's funny, I'm reading it, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm actually reading the Matrix sequels. And they had this sort of this different vibe about, because they were looking at me like, who is this dude from Warner Brothers coming over here?
And especially because you had a suit on. I think if you would have dressed like how we dress in the game industry, they would have been like, okay, but what we finna do?
Yeah, mistake number one, right? Yeah. And so the funny part to me was, it's like after my initial sort of, them sort of looking at me like, I remember I used to go visit the studio every Friday to give them updates, tell them what's going on, read more of the script. I felt like Batman because I look to my left, I look to my right at Warner Brothers. I go into the bathroom. I take off my suit and tie, put on ripped jeans, like put in the earrings, and I had this still nose ring at the time, and
That's
so on
hilarious.
and so forth. And and then I'd be like, oh, it's me, and then I go to see them, and eventually they got to the point where they loosened up, and I said, you don't understand, like you caught me in my Bruce Wayne outfit, I don't usually get down like that,
Yeah.
So, and so working at Warner Brothers taught me like the film biz, right? Like how people talk, like how in a meeting it's funny to not hear what people say, but hear what people don't say. Like, what didn't they say, right? And you grow. And so going from Warner to going to Sigil, for example, which was these were guys from that did old EverQuest.
Mm-hmm. You're working on Vanguard there, right?
Yeah, and look,
you were oversight on design and code.
Yeah.
Okay, so even as a senior producer here, you still went back into
the team
fundamentals of.
Well, the team is huge.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So I wasn't the only producer.
Oh, okay.
And being on a development level, you have to have like the Vanguard team was over 150 people. Okay. You just can't have one producer, right? So so basically, production split up into several different groups, and so I was design producer and code producer. That taught me Vanguard taught me a lot about patience.
Okay.
Right. The team in particular, because they just made EverQuest, so you couldn't tell them shit, right? Like
they were coming from a win, so they had a little cloud about them.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And at the time, I've been in the business for about 15 years.
Okay.
And because I've been in business for about 15 years, I had gained a healthy respect for things that have happened before me. There have been several games that I have tried to emulate, didn't do well, and learn from them. And so when I saw people making these mistakes, I wanted to keep them from making the mistakes. But it's smart people that I found that you had to manage smart people differently. And to be honest, I think I feel like I made some mistakes at Sigil where I wouldn't make today. And it was how I deal with smart people. Because I feel like when you're really smart, no one can tell you shit. But there's a difference in between being smart and being wise. Right? Smart, you can look at a gas stove and say that's hot. That's hot. I shouldn't touch it. Wise is looking at that same gas stove, taking a look at your hand where you've been burned several times and say, it's hot. I know it's hot because I've touched it, and I'm not going to do that, right? And so what's the fundamental difference there? The fundamental difference is that I think that when you're making something that's creative and technical, usually you're trying to do things that people have never done before. So there's not a decent roadmap there unless you've gone through that that process several times, right? So that's the touching of the fire, right? Smart people will go, well, I mean, that fire's technically hot, but how hot is it, right? And now a wise person says, you better not touch that. But a smart person's like, I'm going to do it anyway, right? You learn really well from an ass whooping when you're smart, right? So when you're making product, when you're making games, you can get it right, but it's the iterative process that ends up taking the time. You usually need time to get it right. Like a smart person will get it right eventually, right? The question is, how many swings at bat does that smart person have before, he hits that home run, right? Now, a wise person will go, I'm going to wait for the right pitch. Crack, there it is, right? And so that's the difference. That's the difference is that if you're trying to get from A to B, right, a smart person will get there. A wise person usually get there with less steps, right? And that'll end up saving you money, right? So a lot of the Vanguard people were smart. They just weren't wise.
Gotcha.
And I tried to force wisdom when you can't, right? Like as a producer, and I've learned this and I've used it, and it's been very effective for me, is I'm not going to stop you from having what I think is a dumb idea. Instead, what I'll do is if I think it's really dumb, I'll speed you on your way to that. Right?
To help them see the error in their ways.
Well, maybe.
That's a tricky road.
Or you about to show me something, right? And so a lot of times at Sigil, what I would say was, it's funny because I have a lot more experience than you, but I never say that I'm right as much as I say I strongly suspect. Right? Okay. Because I've learned to be dubious is a good thing. Like, when I saw Lisa come to my office, for example, and show us like, hey, here are these index cards, right? And you take these index cards, you turn them to the side, and that we call that tapping. And seeing like Magic the Gathering happen at that point, right? Seeing Sam Hauser come, and talk to us about robbing and stealing cars and being dubious. Seeing, having a conversation with Vince about, how a first-person shooter is supposed to be, and me saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't do that. After a while, you need to cut that out. You need to stop thinking that you're right all the time and think that I should allow for the fact that you might be right. Okay? So with that in mind, you tell me what you need to do to get from point A to point B your way, and let's go fast. Okay? Because what I want to do is I want you to get to that point, that inflection point where you can say this was either a good move or this wasn't. Because if I keep fighting you, for example, all we're doing is spending money and going nowhere, right? In production, the only bad decision in my mind is no decision, because no decision keeps you in this loop, right, where nothing ever gets done, right? A bad decision will get you to a bad place, and you can look at each other and go,
how much time we got left?
How much time we got left? Let's do something different, right? And so for me, when I think about in retrospect, like, and Sigil was a crazy place. If I did a little bit more of that, I think that it would have been better for me. At the end of the day, they just didn't have money to pay me because we were supposed to make a Marvel game, and that Marvel game went to another studio, and so which eventually got me to Sony, which was a great.
And
place.
Everything happens for a reason. I mean, it's good that you're still having those learning moments. It would have been crazy for you to say, "Oh, things just didn't work out," but it's good that you still had that as an experience that you haven't yet had, or being able to practice wisdom, or knowing that you should have practiced a little bit more patience and being wise. That's important. It's good to know.
Yeah, I mean,
keep in mind.
Look, being introspective about about things, and it's crucial, and I think that in production and in particular, one of the, and I don't know if I would limit it to production, but I'd say making games in general, the worst trap you could be in is using yourself as your test market or making a product for you. I respect the sweetness of it, right? Like, I'm making things that I want, and that's great. But at some point, you have to make what players want.
Yep.
Right? Like, it's not just about you.
And that's a fine line, too. It's different to say make what players want, and then you iteratively keep changing your idea and throwing things away. I think that's a fine line. It's a little different than getting feedback from fans and then just gutting your system and trying to make it over. It's about making what as a gamer what you would know is fun and what other people would know is fun based off of like data, market. There's a lot of stuff that you can pull from as a producer. I would think you're looking at a bunch of things.
Well, now you are. Back in the day, you didn't have that. Like, like having any analytical data, you didn't have that. Like, you had your instincts. But now it's not even a question. I mean, there's so much data that you can pull from your games now to tell you like what people are doing, what people aren't doing, that there's almost no excuse for having a really bad product at this point. If you have the time and you have talented people, like, you shouldn't be making bad product.